than not, if I'm watching TV and I actually have control of the remote, it'll be on ESPN, and so I'll watch ESPN, like a lot of different sports. And when it comes to watching sports on TV, it's mostly like basketball and football, right? And maybe a little bit of golf, maybe a little bit of baseball, though I'd rather watch baseball in person than on TV. Watch the Husker volleyball games like that too, but mostly basketball and football. And to be honest, I'm not much of an athlete, though I did win our church's fantasy football league this year, so I have that going for me. But I like to watch sports, and one thing about sports that is so interesting, intrigues me, is that sometimes you will have players or you will have teams that are super hyped, right? And they don't really amount to much. All these 4- and 5-star recruits on their team, and they end up turning out to be a bust. Or teams that are loaded with individual talent, and everybody's saying they're going to win the championship, and then they don't even make the playoffs. And then there are those teams and those players that fly underneath the radar and are much more successful than anybody thought. I mean, I think of like our Wayne High football team this year. I don't think anybody expected them to have the success that they did this year. And when it comes to recruiting, most schools, like in college, they want those 4- and 5-star recruits. That's what they want. They want those upper echelon recruits, and sometimes, and probably many times, those 4- and 5-star recruits, they maximize their talent, they reach their potential, and they end up being great players. But then other times they don't. Right, you have those 5-star bust type players, or the person that gets drafted first in the NBA draft and then never even makes the team. And but then you have those teams, those players that are kind of overlooked, and they're not highly sought after, not highly recruited, especially by the schools that they want to go to, and so they walk on. That's what it's called. They walk on to a program. And so I did a little research this week to find out some of the top walk-ons in college football. And so a walk-on is somebody that's not offered initially a scholarship at a program, maybe not highly recruited, and sometimes they'll be asked to come and be a walk-on because the coach sees potential that maybe they'll develop. Other times they'll just show up on campus and say, "Coach, I want to play," and the coach says, "Okay, well, you can try out and we'll see if you make the team," and they walk on. And sometimes those walk-ons end up having great careers, not just in football, but also, or not just in college, but also in the pros. And so I did a little research, and these are 5 fairly recent walk-ons that end up having great college careers and also end up having became starters in the NFL. So like at a receiver position, you had Santana Moss and Jordy Nelson. They were walk-ons. Baker Mayfield, starting quarterback in the NFL, he walked on to his university. Defensive stars in the NFL like Clay Matthews and J.J. Watt were both walk-ons to their universities. Can you imagine not offering J.J. Watt a scholarship right away? We look at where he is now and we can't imagine that. That's somebody that he's maximized his potential. And we're in this series where we're talking about how do we maximize our potential? How do we maximize the resources we have, but not for our own personal benefit, our own personal gain, but how can we align our resources with God's priorities? And last week we kind of focused in on this question to answer that is, what do I need to do now so that I will be ready then? What do I need to do now so I'm prepared when Jesus returns? And we can answer that question in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different applications for this, but in this series we're focusing primarily on our resources of time and money. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it to Matthew chapter 25. The Gospel of Matthew, the 25th chapter, towards the end of Jesus' life on earth. And in this chapter, Jesus tells 3 stories. He tells 3 parables that have to do with this idea of aligning our resources with God's priorities. And last week we talked about the first story. It's kind of a lesser known parable. It's known as the parable of the 10 virgins. It's one we're not super familiar with, but in the story, it's all about the fact that we don't know when Jesus is going to return, and so we need to be ready now. It could be today, it could be another 2,000 years from now, and since we don't know, we need to be ready now. We need to be prepared today. This morning, we're going to be looking at a parable that's a little bit more familiar if you grew up in church. It's known as the parable of the talents. And what you need to know is that in the Bible, a talent was a measurement of money. When we hear the word talent, we think of a skill or ability, and that's not what the Bible refers to. The Bible's talking about a sum of money, a measurement of money. And so we read in this story about this wealthy man who goes on a business trip, and he entrusts his servants with his resources, with his money, his wealth. Verse 14 says, "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey. He called his own servants, and he entrusted his possessions to them." Now, it wasn't unusual for a wealthy man to go on an extended journey. He may have been going on a business trip. He may have been looking at other land that he could purchase, or maybe some other properties that he owned, or looking at different ways where he could invest his resources. We don't know exactly what, but he went away on a journey, and his servants have no idea how long he's going to be gone for. Maybe a couple of days, maybe a few weeks, maybe even several years. They don't know. All they know is that they need to be ready when he returns. Verse 15. "And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, depending on each one's ability. And then he went on a journey." Now remember, a talent was a measurement of money. It was worth roughly 20 years' wages for a day laborer. 20 years of wages for a day laborer. So quite a bit of money. I did some research this week here in Wayne, and the most recent statistic I came from was from 2017. And in 2017, the per capita income in Wayne was $25,764. So you think about 1 talent being 20 years worth of wages. 1 talent would be equal to roughly $500,000. 2 talents would be around $1 million, and 5 talents would equal $2.5 million. So we're not talking chump change here. Each was given a significant amount of money, but still in our Western culture, we can get hung up on the fact that they weren't given the same amounts. There wasn't equal distribution, was there? And we can get caught up on that. It doesn't seem fair. Why did one guy get 1 talent and another guy get 5 talents? That's not fair. I mean, doesn't the Bible teach that all men are created equal? Well, that's not in the Bible, right? That's the Declaration of Independence. That's something completely, entirely different. But still, it doesn't seem fair to us that there's unequal distribution. But notice that it wasn't arbitrary. Each one was given an amount in keeping with their ability. Think of it this way. Think back to the kind of a sports analogy. Let's say your favorite basketball team is playing in the NBA Finals. And it's game 7, winner take all. Winner is the champion, and your team is down by 1 with 8 seconds to go in the 4th quarter. Coach calls a timeout, gathers the players together, and the coach is going to design a play that has one player being the number 1 option. More than likely, he'll have a second option and a third option as well. But there's one player particularly that he wants taking that shot to win the game. Now, does that mean that the other players don't matter? Does that mean the other players aren't good? No, not at all. It's just that the coach understands that there's one player that he trusts in that high-pressure situation to make the shot. Or think of students at school. Some students they have a naturally higher ability in math than other students, right? There's just some that get it. There's others that are more naturally gifted in English, others where they're really good at applied sciences and so forth. It's just this fact of life that we all have different abilities. We're not all equally good at the same stuff. And the master knew his servants. He knew their skills. He knew what they were capable of. He knew one of the worst things you could do is give somebody more responsibility than they could handle. And that'd be setting them up for failure. And so he gave each of them talents depending on each one's ability. And so what we're going to see in this story is that it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. We want to put the emphasis on what we have, and we compare ourselves with other people who have more. But it's not what we have, it's what we do with what we have. Verse 16 continues. It says, the man who had received 5 talents, he went, he put them to work, and he earned 5 more. In the same way, the man with 2 talents earned 2 more. But the man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The master's been gone a long time. We don't know exactly how long, but maybe it was long enough for them to begin to wonder if he was ever coming back or not. And they're like, man, the days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years, and they begin to think, well, if the master hasn't returned yet, maybe he's not returning at all. Maybe something happened to him. Maybe I should just use this money any way I want. Isn't it my money? But just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean that it won't happen. Just because he hasn't returned doesn't mean that he won't return. A long time passes, but eventually the master returned. So how would you feel about that if you're one of those servants? You're one of the servants, and all of a sudden you receive news the master is back in town and he wants to see you. Are you going to be excited? Or are you going to be a little bit terrified? Well, probably what determines that is whether or not you're prepared for his return. Verse 20. The man who had received 5 talents approached, presented 5 more talents, and said, Master, you gave me 5 talents. See, I've earned 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy. The man with 2 talents also approached. He said, Master, you gave me 2 talents. See, I've earned 2 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy. Notice that both of these servants, they received the same reward and the same commendation. One has 10 talents, one has 4 talents, but they received the exact same reward. And I love how the master says this. He goes, you've been faithful over a few things. Remember, one has been given $1 million, entrusted with $1 million. The other's been entrusted with $2.5 million, and the master's like, that's just a few things. This is incredibly wealthy. He goes, that's just a few things. Just wait to see what I have in store for you. This just blows my mind. But what we see is that they're not rewarded for how much they had, but how faithful they had been with what had been entrusted to them. Again, it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Verse 24. Who had received 1 talent also approached and said, Master, I know you. You are a harsh man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid. And I went off and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. Before he even shows the master what he has, he's making excuses, isn't he? He's blaming the master for his own lack of responsibility. If you just weren't so unrealistic with your expectations. I mean, if you'd been more fair at the beginning, you only gave me 1 talent, you gave him 5. I felt devalued right away. I mean, if you would have been more clear with your instructions, I don't know. I think for some of us, for many of us, at least for me sometimes, that can be kind of our default response when it comes to using our resources as well. Sometimes we'll be confronted with our lack of responsibility. Maybe even we come under a little bit of conviction, and we know, deep down we know, that we haven't done what we should have with what has been given to us. But instead of owning up and taking responsibility, we're like the man in the story, and we deflect, and we blame, and we make excuses, and we complain about our circumstances, and we feel sorry for ourselves. But did you notice what this guy did with the money entrusted to him? It doesn't seem that bad, does it? Sure, he didn't invest it. He didn't put it to work, but at the same time, he didn't waste it. He didn't steal it. He didn't embezzle it. He didn't lose it. He didn't gamble it away. It doesn't seem that bad. He just buried it. He still has it. Yeah, it's kind of dirty. There's still some mud on it from where he dug it up, but he gave it all back. He didn't lose anything. He gave every penny back. It doesn't seem that bad. But the master's furious. Look what it says in verse 26. His master replied to him, You evil, lazy servant. If you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and I would have received my money back with interest when I returned. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Whoever has been responsible will be given more responsibilities. Whoever has been faithful in the opportunities they've had will be given even more opportunities. And throw this good-for-nothing servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Just picture that scene, a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's just wailing, mourning over these regrets he has in his life. Maybe you've been there where you just have to overcome with this deep emotional regret, and you would give anything if you could just go back and do things differently. If you could just go back and change those decisions that you made, you would, but you can't. And now you have this deep sense of regret. And that's what's going on here. And Jesus is saying that that's the way it's going to be for some people when the master comes back. It's going to be this deep emotional regret. As we look back at this story, I see 2 applications for us this morning. The first is that God has generously entrusted us with his resources. So be grateful. God has generously entrusted you with his resources. Be grateful. One of the most basic biblical principles when it comes to finances is this idea of ownership, that God owns it all. Look back at verse 14. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey. He called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. Whose possessions? His possessions. The possessions belong to the master. They're his possessions, and he doesn't give them to these servants. He entrusts them to them. It's this whole idea of ownership, and this issue of ownership, when you understand that, it changes how we understand and how we receive the Bible's teaching about money. Every so often, I do a sermon like this, or maybe even a series like this, where we talk about money. And there are some of you here that you don't mind when I talk about money. In fact, there are some of you here, you even are glad. You actually like it when I preach about money. And I know for some of you, the reason you don't mind when I preach about money is that you get this idea of ownership. You know that God owns it all. You understand what David said in Psalm 24, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord. You know that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And you're like, well, if it all belongs to God, I want to know how I should best handle these resources. But if that's not you, if you view it as your money, you're like, man, I worked hard for it, I earn it, this is my money, nobody's going to tell me what to do with my money, well, then you probably don't like it a lot when I talk about money. It's probably not one of your favorite Sundays. You'd rather know ahead of time and you just skip out, right? I mean, I understand that. But everything hinges on this idea of ownership. When we realize that God owns it all, that he has simply entrusted his resources to us, then we don't get caught up in that comparison game. We don't complain that other people have more than we have, and we will be grateful. We'll just simply be grateful for what God has entrusted with us, and that sense of gratitude that it comes from God wells up and overflows then into generosity. God has given us his resources to be used for kingdom purposes. He's blessed us so that we can be a blessing to others. One of our values here at Journey Christian Church is generosity. Since we know that it all belongs to God, that we're simply entrusted with his resources, we believe God can do more with his resources than we can. So we want to hold on to our money with open hands rather than with clenched fists. And that's why 15% of everything that is given here, 15% of every dollar that comes in then goes out to help support missions right here in Northeast Nebraska, throughout the United States, and then around the world. For example, we support ministries like Christian Student Fellowship that has ministry doing kingdom work right here in Wayne and then all throughout Nebraska and even up into South Dakota. We support groups like Rafa International that provides healing for girls rescued out of the sex slave trade in places like Cambodia. We help fund Bible translation on the remote island of Vanuatu. We partner with missionaries who have been serving for over 50 years in Colombia. One of the missions we support works with orphans and gypsies in Romania. We believe in generosity, and so 15% of everything that comes in then goes back out. And because of your generosity this last year, we were able to partner with area schools to provide almost $11,000 to families in Northeast Nebraska. At the back of the sanctuary, at the back of the auditorium, when you leave, there's this bucket that says 1 for 1 on it. And it's this idea that for some of us here, we might have an extra dollar bill in our pocket, and we want to give that for somebody else. And so loose change goes in there, $1 or $2 goes in there, and it adds up over time. And when we become aware of needs right here in our community and surrounding areas, we have money that we're able to help provide for them. We try to use it to be a blessing. And the reason we do that is because we believe that the money that has been given to us actually belongs to God, that it's his money entrusted to us. In the Bible, when it talks about a failure to be generous, it uses a very strong term. When it talks about a failure to be generous, it actually will use the word stealing. It's a strong statement, isn't it? But not when you understand that it belongs to God. This last week, a family that we helped in the past, gave me a card and told me that it was time for them to pay it forward, which was so great. And I opened up the card, and there was $500 in there. $500 that is to be used to help provide someone in need, somebody who could use a little extra blessing right now. Suppose I took that money and I was like, $500. That'd make a nice weekend getaway with Steph, right? And so nice hotel room, we'd go out to an expensive dinner at a trendy restaurant, even catch a show, it'd be $500. That'd be a nice weekend away. Now, if I did that, would that be a failure to be generous? Or would that be stealing? Be stealing, right? Why is it stealing? Well, because it's not my money. It's not my money to do. I don't have the freedom to do anything I want with it. I've been entrusted with it to bless someone else. And this idea that this is God's money, that He owns it, it changes the way that we view our resources and our possessions. It creates this feeling of gratitude that enables us to be generous. Richard Foster, in his book, Celebration of Discipline, says, God's ownership of everything changes the kind of question we ask in giving. Rather than how much money should I give to God, we learn to ask how much of God's money should I keep for myself. It changes everything. The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 says, and God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. That God has given us everything we need so that we will be a blessing to others, so that we will be generous, so that we will excel in every good work. Which brings us to the second point of application. God will hold you accountable for His resources. So be intentional. We need to be intentional. We need to be obedient because these are God's resources. He's entrusted them to us. Look what it says in verse 19. It says, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The master had been gone, and when he came back, he settled accounts. In Matthew chapter 18, we read something similar. Jesus says, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Now in our text, down in verse 26, do you remember how the one guy who buried the talent was described? Do you remember what terms were used to describe him? He was described as evil and lazy. Evil and lazy. In my mind, those two don't naturally go together, do they? Evil and lazy. When I think of lazy, I think of sitting on my couch and I'm watching ESPN, and now it's like the fifth time that same episode of SportsCenter has been on. If you know how that is, and so I want to change the channel. I've seen the same thing over and over, and so I reach for the remote, and it's not there. And I look and it's over on the table. Laziness is I'm not getting up and going over to the table to pick up the remote control. I'm just going to watch the fifth episode of SportsCenter, right? That's being lazy. It's staying in the bathtub until you get wrinkles on your fingers, right? Is that bad? Well, it's probably not a really good thing, but is it evil? Is it wicked? When I hear lazy, we don't necessarily think wicked. We want this guy to have done something more severe to get the type of punishment he received. Maybe if he embezzled it, maybe if he stole it, we could understand the response of the master, but all he did was bury it. One commentator points out that in early church history, somebody thought that. They thought that the master was being a little too severe, that the story needed to be changed a little bit, so he actually changed one line in the story. Instead of saying that the servant went and buried the talent, he says that he squandered it on harlots and flute players. I don't know how harlots and flute players go together. I guess you have to be really careful of flute playing harlots, right? But he squandered it on harlots and flute players. And if he did that, well, then maybe we can understand the response of the master. But that's not the story Jesus tells. Jesus says that he simply buried the treasure. He didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. See, it's not what you have. It's what you do with what you have. And he didn't do anything. He just simply buried it. And we're told that he buried it because he was afraid. Well, what if it doesn't work out? What if I don't get a good return on my investment? It's going to be a lot better if I just bury it. That way my master can have it all back. I won't lose a penny. We get the idea here of the kind of accountability that we will be held to. That God wants us to use, and he wants us to invest, and he wants us to leverage the resources he's given to us for kingdom causes. So that when he returns, there's going to be a return on investment, not a high interest rate on your 401k or Roth IRA, but a kingdom return on the investment. But it's tempting. tempting to just play it safe, isn't it? We're just going to play it safe, or we get distracted, right? We have good intentions, but then we just get caught up in our to-do list. I mean, every day we're just busy, 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 and we have good intentions, but we just never quite get around to it. Or sometimes if we're obvious, sometimes we just use the resources for ourselves and our own desires. But we're going to be held accountable for how we've used the resources God has given to us. There's coming a time when God is going to settle accounts with us. In Romans chapter 14, Paul says, "So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God." In Revelation chapter 22, Jesus himself says, "Look, I am coming soon, and my reward is with me to repay each person according to his work, according to what he has done." God has called us to intentionally invest his resources to help grow and expand his kingdom. And so we need to ask ourselves, am I serving Christ with the resources he has entrusted to me? Am I using my money, my time, my talents, my family, my relationships, my job? Am I using these resources to help advance the kingdom? You see, we're not just to hang in there until the end. We're supposed to be actively using what God has entrusted to us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12, Paul says, "For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have." You're not going to be accountable for what you have. See, it's not what you have. It's what you do with what you have. This last week, I learned there's this thing called the doomsday clock. Any of you familiar with the doomsday clock? Some of you are familiar with the doomsday clock. It actually began back in 1947 at the beginning of the Cold War. It warns of impending disasters. It takes things into account like nuclear weapons, rising geopolitical tensions around the world, harmful chemical or biological agents, as well as changes to the environment. And 2 years ago, in January of 2018, those who control the clock, they moved it ahead 30 seconds to 2 minutes to midnight. Midnight symbolizing kind of the end of the world as we know it. Some big apocalyptic event's going to happen at midnight. So 2 years ago in January, they moved it ahead to 2 minutes to midnight. And then all of last year it stayed the same. But then in January of this year, they moved it forward another 20 seconds. Saying that we are 100 seconds away from impending doom. This is the closest symbolically we have been to the apocalypse, they say, since 1953. Are we a symbolic 100 seconds away from the apocalypse? I don't know. They don't know. I mean, we don't know, right? Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 36 now says, "Now concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Neither the angels of heaven nor the Son." Jesus says, "I don't even know," except the Father knows. We don't know how much time we have left. Only God knows. It could be at any time. It could be today. It could be another 500 years, 2,000 years. We don't know. And so as we asked last week, what do I need to do now so that I'm ready then when the master returns? In verse 16, it says, "Immediately the man who had received 5 talents went, put them to work, and earned 5 more." Immediately. He didn't delay. There's a sense of intentionality here. It's not just good intentions. We need to take some action. We need to do something immediately to use our resources to help advance the kingdom of God. And so for some of you, maybe that means that you need to start tithing, that you need to give 10% of the money that you make, and you need to give it to kingdom causes and bring it into the storehouse of God. And you understand that since God owns it all, since it's his money, that God can do more in your life with 90% than you can with 100%. Or maybe you already tithe, and you're sensing God saying, you need to give even more to charitable contributions. You need to raise the level that you give to help support missions, or maybe some group in our community that's doing a really good work. Or maybe for some of you here, you're a young mom, and you all day long, all you do is chase kids, and you don't have time or resources really for anything. Well, maybe the best use of your time, your best use of your resources is to invest that time that you do have with your children to teach them the love of Jesus. Or maybe you're an empty nester, and you're still busy. You're still busy. There's things to do, but you're busy with things that you choose to do. And maybe you need to choose to teach Sunday school and invest in that next generation, letting them know of the love of Jesus. The list, the opportunities are limitless as your imagination. But the point is that it's not what you have, right? It's what you do with what you have. Father God, we thank you for what you have given to us. Father, I know for me, it's easy for me to look at my money as my money. It's easy to look at my calendar and say it's my calendar. It's easy to look at the resources I have and claim them as mine. Father, help me to realize that everything I have comes from you. Even the ability to work comes from you. And so I have no rightful claim to my stuff, but that it's yours. Father, may we individually, may we collectively as a church understand this idea of ownership, because it does change the way we view our money and resources. May we view it as yours. And Father, give us the courage to act, to do something, to not let it just be good intentions, but to actually do something, to invest the resources you've given to us to help advance your kingdom. Father, we thank you that you didn't wait, you didn't delay, that you sent Jesus while we were still sinners to come and die for us, to offer forgiveness and life with purpose now and life eternal with you. Lord, in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen.